was talking to somebody today, and the subject of motivation came up. Motivation, laziness, and dealing with the drudgery of life and finding motivation to persist despite the drudgery of life, despite this feeling that we often get of the monotony and the boredom and all of that. And one of the things that I wanted to point out is that I think there are a lot of people who are down on themselves about being quote unquote lazy, about not achieving nearly as much as they feel they have a potential to achieve. And I think that, this question of laziness, unfortunately, a lack of motivation or a difficulty in finding motivation is one of those challenges or problems in society that we still affix a moral quality to. In other words, if someone finds it difficult to get out of bed in the morning or to do the tasks that they're supposed to do to earn an income, or even beyond that, if someone finds it difficult to push themselves to the extent that they need to be very successful or to meet the expectations of those around them or themselves, right? This phenomenon, this difficulty that so many of us have in different ways or different aspects of our life, right? I mean, you can have someone who is great at work, but maybe not so good taking care of their bodies, right? Like successful executives or whatever who also eat terribly or have a gut they can't get rid of or whatever, right? So what you find when you look at people is that usually almost everyone has at least one area in their lives in which they could be called lazy. Now, I don't like the term lazy because, as I said, it has a kind of a moral and ethical connotation to it. If you are unable to, or if you find it difficult to be motivated to do the things that you need to do or that are expected of you or to excel, then there must be some kind of moral defect in you, right? And, going back to the idea of like the 7 deadly sins, right? Sloth. But what I have found and others have found is that, in fact, generally speaking, people who are suffering from a lack of motivation, that what we ascribe often to laziness is really one or more of a number of existentially profound but morally, we could say morally valueless scenarios. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that we tend to think of laziness in terms of morality. Oh, he's so lazy, or she's so lazy, or the reason you can't do that is because you're lazy, right? As if there's a sin, right? It's wrong. You're committing a kind of a moral failing. But when I say that I see a lack of motivation or difficulty in motivation as being actually morally valueless, what I'm saying is I don't think that that is a correct way of looking at it, of looking at lack of motivation in terms of moral failure. Rather, I think that what we actually find when we look at people, most of us who in some area of our lives, maybe more than some, have these motivational issues, is that there's a lot of existential stuff going on. Maybe different for different people. For some people, quite a number of people in this world that we're in, depression is a very, very significant problem. And I don't know if rates of depression are higher than they would have been hundreds of years ago. I know that we generally have that assumption, and I do think that there's a correlation between living in modern society with all of the ways that modern society and technology and the pace of modern society and media and all of this sort of sap our energy from us, have a kind of an enervating effect, while at the same time ginning up our anxiety. I think that has a lot to do with depression, this sort of sense of just that we're just always sort of exhausted by modern life, and definitely I'm not the first to say it. It's what a lot of people have thought, including a person that I'm going to talk about in a moment. I think so, and I think that most of us are not getting nearly the amount of exercise that we evolved to get. You look at our ancestors, most of us can look back at our ancestors not more than maybe a couple of generations removed. And what you find in your history, in the history of humanity, is that the vast majority of our history, people were involved and engaged in physical labor like constantly. And we don't do that nowadays, you know. We have these sort of uncomfortable office, you know, setups or whatever, but that's just not the life that that most of us in modern, you know, Western society, or I should say modern developed society, most of us deal with. You might say, well, what are you talking about? That's very elitist. You know, some of us have jobs waiting tables or working at McDonald's or whatever. Yeah, I recognize that. I've had jobs, I've had a lot of jobs waiting tables and stuff. But this is what I'm trying to say, is that even waiting tables, you know, you're still not getting as much exercise as your ancestors probably got. And you've got all these gadgets in your face and stuff when you're not waiting tables, or sometimes even when you sort of are, right? Look at how many people, you know, in a typical restaurant and the wait staff, they wait their tables and they go back to the back and the phones come out immediately. So the point that I'm trying to make is just that even for the working classes, the laboring classes in modern society, I think that we modern people are still subject to a lot of things that engender depression. And one of the main symptoms of depression is a lack of motivation. You know, depression typically is not people just crying all the time. I mean, yeah, moodiness can be a problem, but it's often just a deep lack of motivation, and a sense that you don't enjoy anything, you don't engage with anything. So I think that there's a lot of depression, and I think in our modern society especially, and I think that a lot of people, depression, anxiety, psychological exhaustion, and a lot of people don't even know what it is because they've never known anything else. And so they think, well, it's laziness. You know, I've just found this in life, that a lot of the people that I have met who seem to not struggle with laziness and who seem hyper-motivated, they just run on a different setting. I mean, I know some hyper-achievers that it's just like they're on speed all the time and they're not taking anything. One of them is my sort of mother-in-law. I mean, that woman, she is just a ball of energy. She can barely sit still. She's planning, she's building, she's doing all this stuff, and it works out great for her. But I look at her and that's like a fucking alien to me. That's like she looks like someone on speed to me, right? Definitely not my experience. My experience is, you know, oftentimes it's a killer just to get out of bed in the morning. So I think some of what's going on with this sort of laziness is depression. I think also that there are people who, for various reasons, just have a really low threshold for boredom. And I think if those people could find things in life that really engaged them at the level of stimulation that they really need, or the level of interest that they really need, then we would see perhaps more motivation. Because what I've found is that even the people who have great difficulty applying themselves to whatever they're supposed to be applying themselves to, if you look at their lives in other areas, you see that actually they have a great deal of motivation. I've rarely known someone, you know, unless we're talking about clinical depression, I have rarely known somebody who there was nothing in their life that they could get excited about or motivated about. Or, you know, usually everybody's got one thing at least that they're like, if you can get them into that mode, they're going. And so I think that, and I understand that in this world that we live in, I understand not everybody can do the job that they feel passionate about. And I understand that just due to the constraints, the material constraints of living in this world and the way that our economy is organized and labor and just all of these realities, that we still have to have a lot of people doing jobs that are not existentially fulfilling to them. But just because it has to be that way right now does not mean that that is the ideal existential state. You know? I mean, it used to be, go back, you know, look at what infant mortality used to be. Well, people used to just shrug their shoulders and say, well, that's just life, right? Well, it was life until we did something different, until we progressed. And I'm not talking about some kind of utopic, like, communist society that doesn't accord with the realities of human nature. But I'm just saying that as with a lot of things, I believe that we are not the end point of evolution, and that one day we as a species will evolve to a point where we can have much more of our population, hopefully one day with technology, our entire population engaged in work that they find that they're doing because they find it existentially stimulating, and not because, you know, they have to do it. I don't know that there's too many people who just love working at McDonald's or whatever. I actually did enjoy waiting tables when I did it, just because I felt like there was variety and stimulation, and you did get exercise. But and so I don't, But I'm just saying um, that I think that part of what's going on too with people who have trouble getting motivated or getting engaged in life is that their life is just not according them the level of stimulation or the proper channels or the best outlets for their personality, for their background, for their makeup. And again, I understand that there's a certain point at which we just have to get real about life, Yeah, you may not want to work at this job, but you want to have food, right? You want to have shelter. You can sort of like your parent. You can hear your parent in your ears, like, well, you may not like it, but you got to get real. I understand, and everybody has to be prepared in their lives to do jobs that are drudgery and that they get nothing out of, and I've done it myself. I often found teaching to be drudgery, quite frankly. It takes a lot of energy to teach well. Yeah, you can phone it in, but I never like to do that. It takes a lot of energy to teach well. It's like performing. You have to get really, you have to get really like worked up to do it. You have to be energetic. You have to be at at just the tip of your toes and engaging and all of that. And I would say most of the time I didn't enjoy it, even being good at it. So, we as human beings, we have this very sort of complicated thing to figure out about this balance in our lives between necessity and enjoyment, and how much are you supposed to do or put up with stuff that isn't mind-numbing to you. And I don't know the answer to that, but I do think it's a lot more complicated than just saying someone's lazy. And I think, too, that there are a lot of people who have unconscious hang-ups, or in a kind of a Freudian or psychoanalytic sense, unconscious hang-ups or fears that are holding them back. I think that we all have a very profound death drive, a Freudian death drive. I've talked about it before, a self-destructive instinct that manifests itself in various ways, and I think procrastination is one of them. There are so many instances, and we've all experienced this, I think, where we procrastinate something that we need to do, and we keep procrastinating, and the whole time that we're procrastinating, it's actually causing us a great deal of misery, because we feel that anguish of knowing we should be doing it and putting it off. And then what happens when we finally are forced to do it? We realize that it really wasn't that bad. That paper that you've been putting off for a month, or that task that you've been putting off for 6 months, or whatever, you finally sit down to do it and you think, it's not that bad, or maybe I even kind of enjoy it. Why was I procrastinating? Well, you were procrastinating perhaps because there is an essential unconscious element of self-destructiveness within each of us that Freud and many of the other psychoanalysts have recognized. And we have a regressive instinct. That at the same time that we're trying to move forward and do well in life and be happy and healthy and all that, is trying to drag us back as hard as it can. And so a lot of people who deal with this procrastination instinct are actually dealing with an ambivalence, a structural ambivalent split within themselves that is manifesting itself through this kind of procrastinating behavior, much like the split manifests itself through other destructive behaviors like addictions or so forth. Look at the video that I did on Johnny Depp and Amber Heard and the fatal attraction and the idea of the split within the self. It's a few videos back. I also did a video on the death drive and Will Smith. Anyway, so I think that, for some people, what they really need to confront is the fact that there is a part of them that seems to want to destroy themselves. There's a part of the self that wants to destroy the self. And sometimes the best way to deal with procrastination or to deal with this thing that wants to drag you back is to be able to recognize it and to say, this feeling that I'm having right now, this urge to not move forward, this urge to hurt myself, this urge to not progress, this urge to procrastinate, this urge to stay stuck, that it's not laziness. This is actually me wrestling with a deep and pervasive and significant existential split that manifests itself in different ways, but in almost every human being. And is a really tough nut to crack. But sometimes just recognizing it can free up some space then. If you know what it is you're really fighting, if you know what the enemy is, you know who the enemy is. And it's not laziness for most people. It's not some kind of moral failing. Others are terrified of failure. Others are terrified of trying and failing. Others people are afraid of trying for things and then being laughed at if they don't get them. I experienced that even starting this YouTube channel. Honestly, it didn't take much courage to start this YouTube channel because things weren't going well in my chosen career that I didn't even like half of the time, you know. But things weren't going that well. And I don't mean in terms of getting in trouble. I just mean like, you know, they eliminated my position, and so my full-time position. And then I didn't have any kids. And so I was like, what do I have to lose? But I do think that a lot of people have dreams, and it may not be a YouTube channel, but I think a lot of people have professional dreams and personal dreams and all kinds of stuff that they would really like to be acting on, but they can't find it in themselves to get motivated to do it because they're also dealing with this fear of failure, a fear of being laughed at. Well, who do you think you are starting a YouTube channel? You think you're such hot stuff, people want to listen to you, you know? Or whatever your dream is, right? That other people might think is silly or inappropriate or an expression of ego or who knows, right? People are afraid to fail. They're afraid of embarrassment. They're afraid that they might succeed and still be disappointed, you know? The horror of, as Jim Carrey said, getting to the end of your dream, reaching your dream and realizing that you're still not happy. There's all this complex stuff going on. And we're not even, and again, it's at the level often of the semi-conscious or the unconscious. And so all we're aware of is that there seems to be this block. You know, we try to act, or we want to act, or we want to try something, or we want to excel, or we want to commit ourselves, or we want to work hard. But it's like there's this thing that's like, it's this feeling of being like stuck. Well, you are stuck. You're stuck in a bind with yourself. This is like you and yourself in this tight little closet. You just keep knocking against each other. Well, a lot of people can't get out of that existential conundrum, and that's labeled laziness by people who don't understand. Because it's easier. It's much easier to just say, oh, you're lazy, than to say, oh, you've got these complex, you know, psychoanalytic issues, existential issues, but can't, you know, that you need to try to tease out. You may not even be able to tease out. You spend your whole life trying to tease out and still, you know, be struggling, right, in some of these cases. Life is a slog at times. But I want to think about some strategies, and God knows that this is something I struggle with. But I want to talk about some strategies that I have found in my life that can be helpful. And one of them I just said, you know, self-awareness, trying to get to the bottom of like what you're really fighting, you know. But I think too that when it comes to things like fear of failure, fear of embarrassment, fear of doing something different, fear of going out on a limb and then it doesn't work out, or fear of getting your dream and then you're still not happy, all of these fears. And I think that this is where, and I've talked about this before, if you want to look at the video I did on the philosophy playlist, I think it's called Making the Most of Your Life. I talk about this actually in several videos on the philosophy playlist, but this fear, I think that when one really comes to terms with one's mortality and with the inevitability of death and really internalizes that often provides a great deal of freedom because, you know, once you realize that you're going to die and that whether you succeed or you fail or you disappoint people or you make them happy or they laugh at you or they don't or whatever, that it's kind of all obliterated by death in the end anyway, then you really can acquire this sort of, what have I got to lose? I might as well err on the side of going for it. And that's what Steve Jobs says in that famous lecture that I've talked about before that he did at the Stanford commencement, when he talked about how thinking about his death was one of the best tools that the most effective tools for achieving, for doing, for getting out there, for going out on a limb, for trying to take those risks, for motivating yourself. He says, once you realize that you are already naked, in other words, like you're already dead, then all these things like fear of embarrassment and failure and what people think and all of that, they just melt away. The worst thing is already going to happen to you. And in some, you know, you're going to die. And in some ways, I know that that's demotivating. For some people, that's deeply demotivating. In fact, one of the things, and here's another thing that often gets labeled as laziness, one of the things that I find often very unmotivating is to realize that no matter what I'm going to do, I'm going to die, right? So it's like, you know, well, why put in all the effort into this? I'm just going to die. Why do this? I'm just going to die. And yet, that's true. And that's a real tough nut to crack as well. But if you can flip the script on that and say, well, okay, in a way, everything is meaningless. And I'm not talking about in a larger sort of cosmic level. Look at my video that I just did. It's on the philosophy playlist about why I believe in God, why I'm open to the idea of a higher purpose and all of that. Okay, I'm not closed off to that, but I'm just saying from our perspective of what we can see here, what we see is this short life and then death and the seeming pointlessness of it from our perspective. And I'm saying that you can flip the script on that. I know that's demotivating in a lot of ways, but you could flip the script on that and you can say, well, if that is the case, then what have I to lose or fear? Might as well try to have a wild ride or a successful ride or shoot for the stars or whatever. Now, I know when you have kids, that becomes more complicated. And I know that, there's something almost kind of elitist about some of what I'm saying, because it sounds like, some people, there's a lot of people who are just trying to make it in life, just trying to make it in the sense of like feed themselves or their families or put their kids through, school or whatever. And they're like, what are you even talking about fulfillment? But everybody in their lives, no matter what situation you are stuck in, and how sort of humdrum it may seem or monotonous or how trapped you may feel, everybody does have at times, I believe, at times they have some exit ramps. Maybe not an exit ramp to, the life of Johnny Depp, although Johnny Depp's life the last few years has not been one to envy, right? But I mean, it may not be an exit ramp to like the ultimate American dream or whatever, whatever people think about superstardom or fabulous riches or admiration of everyone. But it may be an off-ramp to a better life than the one you have now. And I do think that even when people are stuck in really difficult positions where they feel like they have no options, I do think oftentimes that feeling of not having options is a kind of a small-mindedness or a kind of a fear or a kind of an existential conflict that is being expressed in a certain inability to see beyond one's current state. And there are plenty of people who've had all kinds of issues. They've had children, they've been stuck in dead-end jobs, they've had health issues or whatever, but that they've still found motivation to see the opportunities for improvement along the way, or to see a road that might lead to an off-ramp and take it. And I say that to be motivating. I don't say that to chide anyone, because again, I'm not into this whole like lazy thing, or you should have been doing that, or you missed the boat here. That's just not productive for life, and it's not even accurate. And I think that there are a lot of people too who are stuck in situations where other people in their lives are pressuring them. Look at my Gisele Bundchen, Tom Brady video that I did. I talk about this, that there, and other videos, right? What do we owe other people? That's another one that I did in the philosophy playlist. I think there are a lot of people who have been pressured into lives that they did not want because other people are telling them what they're supposed to do. And I think that often those people in their lives are well-intentioned, but I think that there are too many people who think that what works for them would have to work for someone else, or that just because they've settled for something that someone else needs to settle, or whatever. And, the life that I am living right now is definitely not the one that my parents would have chosen for me. I believe they would have chosen, or talking about my mom who loves me dearly, but she would have chosen a much more conventional route for me, where I am married in a really comfortable material existence, and I have kids, and I just, got this sort of dependable job or whatever, right? And I understand that, because the safe route is what people usually want for their kids and usually want for people they love. Because people in life want to feel like they can check off the box and move on to something else. I don't mean to be cold, but a lot of parents and a lot of people, the way that they view others that they care about in their lives is like, okay, this problem needs to be managed. There's nothing wrong with that, but I'm just saying, like, they look at their kid and they're just like, okay, how do I get this person into as safe a situation as possible so I can check it off? Job done. And what we often find in life is that people are complicated. Our kids want different things from us. I don't have any kids, but I'm just saying. And it's often, so we all get a lot of pressure from people in our lives who think that they know either what is best for us or what is safest for us. And I think that one of the challenges in life is to actually see people for who they are and meet them where they are. rather than trying to turn them into something that you think would make you more sort of comfortable. And so what I'm saying is I do think there are also some people in life who feel like they're lazy or they're being labeled as lazy or whatever, when in fact they're rebelling against being put into a box that does not feel like it's what is right for them. And I think that that perhaps if people at times were given a little more like license or room to sort of breathe or even make mistakes or even bottom out, that at times that could actually be more existentially beneficial. You know, I mean, like I didn't want to lose my job, but it was losing my job that freed me to start making these YouTube videos. And we'll see if that turned out to be the right path or not. But I'm certainly more engaged with life now than I was when I had that job that didn't feel quite right for me, even though I was a good teacher. And sometimes, you know, I have to say also, we human beings, we are very time oriented and we like to take time and we just like to chop it up into all these little pieces, you know. I'll be there in 9 minutes, you know. Or you were late by 5 minutes or whatever. I think, and punctuality is great, okay. I get pissed off if people are late too. But I'm just saying, we're so like fixated on the increments of time that I think sometimes we think that if we're going through a rough patch where we're having trouble engaging with things, or we're having trouble getting motivated, or we're having trouble being successful, that we get this impatience and we think there's got to be a way to fix this. Well, maybe life doesn't want you to fix it at that moment. In fact, maybe the journey that you're on is supposed to involve some periods of not knowing what to do, of frustration, of a lack of motivation. You know, my YouTube channel, people tell me that people have told me before that the aspects of my YouTube channel, my YouTube shows that they find most interesting or beneficial, and I've heard this from my students when I teach, when I've taught as well, are all the little digressions, you know, where I talk about this movie here, or this thinker here, or this thing that happens in life, or this thing we've all experienced, and it's sort of like all over the place. And you know, if I had lived a conventional, straightforward life with 9-to-5 job and kids and whatever, I don't know if I'd have all that stuff in my brain. Because it turns out that all of that time that I've spent over the last 20 years wasting time watching movies and wasting time, you know, reading things that wouldn't amount to anything, or wasting time daydreaming or whatever, it turned out that maybe all of that was more useful to me, or was a kind of a useful process preparing me for something later. And I think we as human beings, we get so trapped in feeling like we are lost in our lives that we don't realize that sometimes even 5 years is not a long time in the scheme of things. There are people who have struggled for years and they think, well, I'll just always be stuck. No, maybe you're supposed to struggle for several years. Maybe there's something you're learning, or you're working out, or you're picking up. I don't know. But I'm just saying that there are a lot of people struggling with motivation, struggling to get motivated, or struggling to do things, and it's getting reduced in their minds and other people's minds to, oh, you're lazy. And I think it is rarely actually a case of a moral failing or of just laziness, whatever that means. I think there's a lot of other things that could be going on, and it would be much more beneficial to people to recognize those things. Now, of course, we still have to, in life, on many occasions, we have to suck it up, we have to gut it up, and we have to make ourselves move. And I do think that it's very true that you can get, and I suffer from this, that you can get so wrapped up in your head that you can forget that oftentimes you have to step out and just act. You know, it's the philosopher William James and the whole perspective of pragmatism. You don't know what to do? Well, try something. See what result you get. It's better than not trying. It's better than just stewing. And I do think that there are a lot of people who would benefit from, you know, I have to force myself all the time, you know, with these YouTube videos, even though like when I get into these YouTube videos, they can be enjoyable sometimes. Even doing the YouTube videos, it's mostly drudgery. I enjoy it more than I enjoyed teaching, right? And I definitely am more engaged with this than I've ever been anything in my life. So it's good. Things are on the upswing. But I'm just saying that, you know, yes, everything in this difficult mortal world, it's going to have drudgery attached to it. And I do think that you know, there's so many times when I felt depressed or I felt unmotivated and I don't want to make that video or I didn't want to teach that lecture, and I'm just like, okay, here we go. And then what happens? I start doing it. And then it starts to come, right? And then maybe I even have some moments of enjoyment. But I do think that there are limits to this notion of like, oh, you just force yourself to do stuff. Well, maybe it's right to force yourself at times, and maybe at other times you're actually supposed to not force yourself. Actually, maybe you're supposed to ask yourself, well, what's going on here? Why am I not wanting to do this? Why am I resisting? But I will tell you, I think that one strategy that is incredibly helpful and motivating, and at last I get to one of the final, I think, obstacles that people face in getting motivated, and that is we as human beings, and I've talked about this some before in other philosophy videos, we have a real resistance to committing ourselves to things because we perceive correctly that when we choose one thing, it means that we're foreclosing other options. And so we have a tremendous anxiety about commitment, right? Because we think, well, I don't want to commit, 5 years to this job or 10 years to this or this many years to this. What if it's the wrong path and I've thrown myself into this only to realize that I've just thrown myself down the drain? Well, two things. First of all, I think it is very rare in life that you will have experiences that are truly useless. Maybe this is my sort of spiritual, metaphysical sensibility coming through, but I think that a lot of what we see in life as uselessness is actually borne out later to be something of great significance. But I will also say this. The way that I have found to get past that fear of commitment, of committing, that terror of committing myself to a course of action, to a profession, to a bunch of work when I don't know if it's going to go anywhere, right? Like we hate the idea, this is another thing that people call laziness, but in fact is a much deeper phenomenon, is that we are reluctant to commit ourselves to something without knowing that it's going to bring us success because we're aware of our mortality. We don't want to waste time. So we have all of this fear of commitment, and this fear, oftentimes this fear of motivation or this inability to motivate oneself is really an inability to get past the fact that we're terrified of wasting time and of committing to things that don't pan out. Well, instead of looking at the changes that you need to make in your life, whether we're talking about addictions you need to drop, or whether we're talking about, healthy habits, or we're talking about professional motivation or whatever, instead of looking at it as this giant commitment, break that commitment down into something that is less scary to you, but still a period of time that will be of some significance. So I think a year, 6 months maybe, for some things, but I think a year is a good barometer because I know that there are things that obviously it takes more than a year to do, okay? Even some hardcore addictions, it can take years for the brain to get back to normal, right? I've heard people before talk about how, Valerie Bertinelli got really strung out on coke when she was with Eddie Van Halen. She said it took her 4 years of being sober before she could appreciate a sunset again because her brain had to get back to normal. Where was I going with that? There are certain things that you need to commit to longer than a year, yes. But what I find is if you can break your commitment down into a smaller increment and just tell yourself, okay, I'm just going to do it for a year. And I'm going to see where I'm at in a year. And what you find, I think, is that it's much more manageable to think of yourself committing to something for 6 months or for a year and then reassessing. Like a lease, right? I don't know if I can commit to this car, so I'm going to lease it. And then I'm going to drive that car, love driving that car, but then I know I have an off-ramp. I can assess, is this working for me? We can always reassess in life. And I do know that there's lost opportunities, and I know that, the time is ticking and that we don't have endless opportunities or endless possibilities. But I also think that people get so bogged down in a sense of hopelessness about that they don't see that oftentimes we have a lot more malleability than we think. People marry the wrong person, well, they do get divorced. People start in one profession they don't like, well, they do switch over. And sometimes life has a way of helping us to find these things if we're open to it. But what I would say to you is that if there is something And this is what I was saying to my friend today, because there were some things that my friend was talking about he knows he needs to do, that he wants to do, that he thinks have the opportunity or the possibility of bringing him success, but it's that commitment, right? I think. Give yourself a year, 6 months or a year, or say, I'm going to bust my ass for a year, I'm going to commit myself to this, or whatever it means, and then know that if you've not made progress, you can get out. Let me tell you a story. There's a really famous philosopher named William James. He's considered to be one of the great thinkers one of the great American thinkers. He was into philosophy and psychology and was really, really brilliant, even if maybe a number of you haven't heard of him, but achieved great success in his life. But I want to tell you a bit about his story, and I actually want to read an article here. This is by the guy who wrote that book, The Art of Not Giving a Fuck, which I've actually not read. I've only read this one part of it, and maybe it's a good book. But the guy's name is Mark Manson, the guy who wrote this book. And anyway, one of the things that he talks about in this book is the story of William James. And I just want to read this to you, okay? And just listen, I think this is very interesting. It says, in the mid-19th century, a boy was born into a wealthy family. From the beginning, the boy suffered serious health issues, an eye problem that left him temporarily blinded as a child, a terrible stomach condition that forced him onto a strict diet, and back pains that would plague him throughout his life. Despite his father's disapproval, he aspired to become a painter when he grew up. He practiced his craft, but for years and years, every attempt ended in failure. Meanwhile, his brother, Henry James, you might have heard of him, the great novelist, like one of the best novelists, considered one of the greatest novelists and writers in history. Meanwhile, his brother went on to become a world-renowned novelist. As this guy entered adulthood, many of his health problems worsened. His relationship with his father fell apart, and the young man began to struggle with severe bouts of depression and suicidal thoughts. Desperate to fix his son's situation, the young man's father used his business connections to get the young man admitted to Harvard Medical School. Fortunately, the young man was smart. He could handle the coursework, but he never felt at home or at peace at Harvard. After touring a psychiatric facility one day, the young man mused in his diary that he felt he had more in common with the patients than the other doctors. In other words, this guy is just bouncing from thing to thing. His brother is just tearing it up as the superstar. His dad disapproves of him, and he's trying to make it through Harvard Medical School, even though he's not into it. And he tours a psychiatric facility one day, and he thinks, "Oh, I belong with these crazy patients." Dissatisfied with his medical training, the young man looked for other opportunities within academy that may have suited him. He was desperate. He was willing to try anything, even something radical and completely different. He soon discovered an anthropological expedition to the Amazon rainforest. The young man signed on, excited to get away and start anew, to perhaps discover something new and interesting about the world and about himself. In those days, intercontinental travel was long, complicated, and dangerous. But the young man made it to the Amazon. There, he promptly contracted smallpox and nearly died alone in the jungle. He was rushed back to civilization, and the expedition left him behind. What a joke. Upon recovering from smallpox, his back spasms returned worse than ever. He was emaciated from the disease, stuck in a foreign land alone with no way to communicate, and continued to exist in daily excruciating pain. Well, that's nice. The young man managed to return home to a disappointed father. Now imagine how sick of this father must have been. Because he starts out trying to be a painter, can't do that. He's trying to be a doctor, trying to be a physician, can't do that. Goes to this ludicrous Amazon rainforest expedition, gets smallpox, has to come back. What a fucking failure. Pathetic, right? Supposedly. So he returns home to a disappointed father, nearly 30 years old, which back then, y'all, please understand, 30 years old back then was the equivalent of like 40 or 45 now, okay? It's none of this. We're talking here, like 100 years ago or whatever, okay? We're talking late 19th century, this guy, 30 years old and a fucking failure. 30 years old back then was considered like 45. So it's none of this now where we have this like, elongated adolescent period that goes until you're 30, for better or worse. Nah, none of that now. So this is the equivalent of someone today being a failure at 45. Just a dilettante. Just been doing all this pointless stuff. Anyway, not pointless, as it turns out. Not at all pointless, but all right, continuing. So he returns home to a disappointed father. He's nearly 30 years old. He's still unemployed, a failure at everything he had ever attempted, with a body that betrayed him and wasn't likely to ever get better. Despite every advantage and opportunity he had been given in life, he had failed them all. The only constants in his life seemed to be suffering and disappointment. The man fell into a deep depression and planned to kill himself. But first, before he killed himself, he had an idea that he was going to try. He made an agreement with himself. In his diary, he wrote that he would try an experiment. He would spend one entire year believing that he was 100% responsible for everything that occurred in his life, no matter what. Now understand, responsible does not mean at fault. Okay? There are lots of things that happen to us that we don't cause. Responsible, though, in the sense that instead of saying, oh, this sucks, it's not fair, and so I'm just going to give up, that he would have a kind of a stoic attitude. All right, this is what life has sent my way. I will take responsibility. I will deal with it. That's the attitude we're talking about here. So during this period, he would do everything in his power, this 1 year that he'd given himself before he killed himself. He would do everything in his power to change his circumstances, no matter the outcome. If, he wrote, at the end of 1 year of taking responsibility for his life and working to improve it, if nothing in his life had actually improved in that time, then it would be apparent that he was truly powerless to the circumstances around him, and then he would take his own life. So in other words, he says to himself, I am sick of this life. I am sick of I have no motivation, but I tell you what, before I kill myself, fuck it, I'm going to give myself 1 year, and I'm just gonna go for it. And then at the end of that year, if my life is not significantly better, or if I have not moved along significantly toward my goals, then I'm gonna kill myself knowing that I gave it a shot, no pun intended. The young man's name was William James, the father of American psychology and one of the most influential philosophers of the past 100 years. Of course, he hadn't become these things yet, but he would go on to become them in large part due to his experiment, his 1 year experiment. James would later refer to this experiment as his rebirth and would credit it with everything that he would later accomplish. So I just want to say to you, as a challenge, if you are suffering from a lack of motivation, try to get past this sort of box of self-recrimination and self-blame and all of that, and just, and just say to yourself, look, I'm going to put the blame aside. I'm going to put all of this aside, and I'm going to give it a year, or whatever time frame you want, but I'm going to give it a year. I'm going to go after this dream, or I'm going to try to make improvements in my life, or I'm going to attack this next year like a motherfucker. And then I'm going to see where I end up. And 9 times out of 10, if you do that, then I think when that year is up, when that period of time is up, what you'll find is that you will be much, much closer to the life that you want, and that you'll discover along the way some great things about yourself and what you can really do, what you're really capable of. And, the interesting thing, I want to leave us on one final note. One of the things that's so interesting to me about William James's story is that all of that time that he was dabbling in different things, and I didn't even tell you the half of it. I mean, he was pinging from interest to interest, all of this eclectic stuff, even went to a psychic, got into, mysticism, philosophy, like just all kinds of things, right? Was frequently moving, would move his family around frequently when he was in this restless spirit. It was all over the place, right? And it seemed like it had no purpose, right? I'm sure that at the time it felt like he was Moses, in the wilderness, just exiled, no reason. But the thing is that there's actually a lot that we learn and that we acquire from our time in the wilderness. And what happened was, it was all of that wandering, all of those eclectic interests, all of that stuff that William James got into when he was in his failure phase, That was so much of that was the rich texture, provided the rich texture for his intellectual and professional and philosophical pursuits later in life. And one of the things that he came to be so celebrated for was not just the fact that he became this great intellectual philosopher and psychologist, and all of that, but that he was able to integrate so many interesting things, so many threads from so many different ways of being and different ways of looking at the world. And he was able to be that much more of an engaging thinker and an engaging teacher precisely because, in part, that time that he spent wandering around. Right? So maybe your time in the wilderness is not as pointless as you think. Maybe you're actually on the road to your promised land if you just open your mind up a little more. All right, everybody. As always, if you got something out of this, I appreciate you like, subscribe, and as always, you can tip me on PayPal, Patreon, and all you need on PayPal is a credit card, not a membership. Thank you so much for your support, and I will have more stuff out for you as soon as I can. Bye-bye.